Hello, welcome back to Am I Neurodivergent, a recap of my unexpected autism and ADHD year. I've had a couple of weeks out from doing these videos, so thanks for your patience and thank you to the people who reached out or emailed or messaged me to check I'm okay. I'm fine, basically. I just needed a bit of a time out. I've got out of London for a couple of weeks, which just feels like a massive getting out of the pressure cooker for me, so I'm ready to do some more of these. So the last couple of videos I did, I talked about workplace adjustments you can legally ask for and try to make working a 9 to 5 office job with a neurodivergent condition slightly less soul destroying. Chapter 18, before I get back on some other stuff, is kind of an extension of that, but it works in everyday life beyond work as well. It's picking up on the kind of reluctance neurodivergent people can sometimes have around being assertive, setting boundaries, and standing up for ourselves. And that's something I've definitely been struggling with in real time these past few weeks as well. So this week I want to have a bit of a think about why that struggle with assertiveness might be and whether there's anything we can do to get around that reluctance and stop letting ourselves get kind of pushed around and bounced into things in certain situations sometimes. Struggles with assertiveness, by the way, is another thing like imposter syndrome and body-focused repetitive behaviours that I've talked about before in this video series. It doesn't have to be a neurodivergent thing. It's not always a neurodivergent thing, but it is very, very common in neurodivergent people. Lack of assertiveness, for example, can emerge as a trauma response in anyone. And when, for example, you've grown up undiagnosed neurodivergent, you layer on trauma response after trauma response until you're basically one big walking trauma response. So it's hardly surprising in a lot of ways we tend to have so many of these additional struggles kind of peppered on top of our day-to-day meals. Obviously, when you think of some of the most famous openly neurodivergent people in real life right now, like Elon Musk or Greta Thunberg, lack of assertiveness isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind, but a lot of us really do struggle with assertiveness and boundary setting. It's that basic core belief that we're not good enough, that we're probably wrong in any given situation. There's research that estimates that by the age of 10, for example, kids with ADHD receive 20,000 more negative messages and critiques than their peers without ADHD. 20,000 more negative comments. It's absolutely no surprise that neurodivergent kids tend to grow up into adults with appalling self-esteem issues. It's because we had our childhoods filled up with being told we're somehow failing ourselves. I look back on old school report cards and they're filled with comments from teachers like lazy, not living up to his potential, acting out, struggles to settle, struggles to concentrate, needs to try harder. Couple all that with the common autistic feeling that we can feel these invisible ropes around us a lot of the time that stop us doing and saying what we genuinely want to do and say, which I haven't worked out whether it's innate yet or whether it's because of masking and conditioning. But either way, between all of that, we can really struggle to be assertive and be the drivers rather than the passengers in our own lives sometimes. We can be so obsessed with flying under the radar that we forget to set a clear destination of the place we want to fly to, if that makes sense. I'm coming to this week 18 for me, around 4 months after self-diagnosing on my journey. Had the major burnout, been off work, had the autism assessment, back at work, had a workplace needs assessment, an occupational health assessment at work, who advised my HR that I move to a different team more suited to my strengths. I was overjoyed at this, but my manager at the time, at least initially, was quite resistant to the recommendation, and I find that really difficult because I really hate confrontation and discord. I've always disliked confrontation and discord. I'm the least alpha male of all the boy dogs, which is great for not getting into fights in the playground and at pub closing time, but it can also get you into trouble in terms of not really standing up for yourself, being a bit of a pushover, being a bit of a people pleaser at the expense of your own well-being. If you've been watching this channel and any of this is sounding familiar, I think there's a substantial connection here. Much like the difficulty in parsing different neurodivergent conditions that we've talked about in the past, I think it's exceptionally difficult to parse neurodivergence, lack of assertiveness, lack of boundary setting, and basic personality factors like introversion and lack of self-worth. I think there's a metric ton of overlap here, but because as neurodivergent people we're often over willing to prove ourselves and prove our worth to others, we can get taken advantage of and not listened to. Before I get into why neurodivergent people might struggle with assertiveness and boundary setting, what do I mean by those terms and phrases? As with a lot of things neurodivergent, it comes down to communication differences. Assertiveness is about freeing ourselves up from anxiety, guilt, and anger by communicating and expressing our ideas and feelings without putting down others. It's weird. One of the key things that comes up when you Google neurodivergent strengths, for example, is being open and honest, open and direct, and sometimes too direct for some people. And that comes up as a thing for both autism and ADHD. But as with so many things neurodivergent, the opposite can also be true, and you can actively push yourself down into almost submissiveness. And I'm asking myself, how can both of these things be true at once? And yes, we're all different. You've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person, but I wonder if more of us have this kind of polarity than we realise. And I might be getting this wildly wrong, but my best guess at this point, until very recently, undiagnosed neurodivergent individual, still trying to get to grips with this, is I think we mask and we mask and we mask, and every now and again the mask slips and it all comes kind of bubbling out. We can go, at least I can go from one extreme to the other in terms of communication styles, while finding it very hard to land that productive Goldilocks communication / interaction spot in the middle. There's three broad types of behaviour patterns and responses, right? Number one, assertive behaviour, the gold standard. Number two, aggressive behaviour, not good. And number three, non-assertive behaviour, also not good. And this non-assertive behaviour can take in passive behaviour, passive-aggressive behaviour, submissive behaviour, and manipulative behaviour, none of which are particularly helpful styles. I would argue that from everything I've seen, a good whack of neurodivergent individuals generally sit in this non-assertive camp, with occasional trips to aggressive town, trips which take us and others somewhat by surprise and leave us feeling embarrassed of the emotional meltdowns and pretty crap, both about ourselves and about the people we interact with. Please do correct me in comments if I'm way off base with this, but this is where I'm landing when I'm considering all of this. So of those behaviours, if we look at aggressive behaviour first, it's dominating others, it's not listening, it's being critical of others, it's loudly expressing our views and feelings, it's sense of entitlement that it's our way or nothing. And it's a behavioural style fundamentally rooted in anger, insecurity, and low self-worth. Acting in this way, you upset people left, right, and centre, and you make enemies. We've all met people like this or worked with them. It's bullies, and bullies are rarely happy people. Next, let's look at non-assertive behaviour, which, while the opposite of aggressive behaviour, is also rooted in frustration and low self-esteem. Non-assertive behaviour can oscillate wildly between silent passivity and defensive outbursts. This might sound familiar for a lot of us, I'm guessing, but probably not the way we want to be. But we can't stop it happening and repeating, right? Neurodivergence is plagued by communication differences. Because we find it difficult to communicate exactly what we need and want broadly through a lifetime of being misunderstood, leading to loss of confidence and low self-esteem, those difficulties then compound themselves, and we leave others having to guess at what we're thinking and feeling. And when they don't guess right, we brood and we brood and we feel maligned and misunderstood, and we eventually have a meltdown. Is this understandable? Yes. Is it cool, calm, and sexy? Yeah, not so much. So what do some of these non-assertive behaviours look like in real life? So let's look at passive behaviour first. Passive behaviour is the inability to say no to things out of guilt or shame that we're fundamentally shit, and that if we don't act the way and do the things that other people seem to want us to, they'll see that we're shit too. And you must never let them see the little old man behind the curtain working the levers of the great and powerful Oz, right? Passive behaviour is 100% born out of a fear of failure. It's not speaking up for yourself. It's fear of not being seen as good or being looked on negatively. It's being afraid of what people think of you. It's avoiding conflict by pacifying others. Is that cool behaviour? It is not. But is that what neurodivergent masking often looks like? It very much is. Next, submissive behaviour next. It can be kind of similar to passive behaviour in that it's always trying to accommodate others' needs above our own. There's a starting assumption that our own needs and wants will be seen as less important to others than their own, even when there's no evidence of that. But when we're tired, so very, very tired, then passive people-pleasing is harder to sustain. When we're submissive, we'll put ourselves down, we'll say we're no good at this, and we'll give long explanations and excuses about why we can't do a thing in a desperate attempt to not have people think we're worthless when we don't have the energy to keep doing a thing. The third type of non-assertive behaviour, passive-aggressive behaviour, this is when you start to get pissed off with being either passive or submissive. You take on a victim mentality. You maybe present yourself as more helpless than you probably are to highlight the utter outrageousness in your mind of any demands being placed on you. You express anger, frustration, and aggression, but often in non-direct, hinty ways. You maybe start to deliberately do a bad job of things to prove a point. You start resenting people for disrespecting you and your needs, often when we've willingly put ourselves forward for things we didn't really want to do. And for why? To test whether people will say, no, don't be silly, you already do more than enough, sit down, you've done enough, you're great. Like passive-aggressive behaviour, unchecked, can often bubble over into outright aggressive behaviour, and we can blow our tops and then feel mortified that we've acted out in that way, and then cue recriminations and apologies, and then back to submissive and passive behaviour in this never-ending doom cycle. Lather, rinse, repeat. Manipulation is the fourth type of non-assertive behaviour, and this can manifest as trying to gain sufficient attention for yourself through being needy or using guilt or shame or fear to make others pay attention to you, or threatening to withdraw yourself entirely from a situation if you don't get what you want. It's trying to control the way others react through emotional force. It's getting increasingly desperate at your own lack of autonomy. Is that cool behaviour? It is not. Have any of us done this at times at our low points? Probably. So aggressive behaviour is clearly shitty, and the various manifestations of non-assertive behaviours are pretty shitty too. So what does assertive behaviour look like? Why is it better, and why is it hard for us? Assertive behaviour is saying what you want to say and making yourself understood without becoming aggressive. It's being firm but positive in saying what you want and need. It's having respect for yourself and others. It's placing an exchange of ideas above any feelings of personal rejection. Doubly hard for us sometimes, given the extent of real or perceived rejection we've often faced. There's also other stuff you'll typically read about being assertive that is doubly hard for us. Stuff like maintaining steady, non-threatening eye contact, for example, relaxed and open body language. And that's all written for how neurotypical people tend to be assertive with each other. We really don't have to do any of that shallow, willy-waving silverback stuff. Ideas above feelings, yes, and ideas above ridiculous body posturing, 100% yes. Like, why is that even a thing with eye contact and body language being put on a pedestal? But look, cut through all that, and there is stuff we can take from this and shoot for. There are common communication ideals to be found amongst this, even if it can be doubly hard for us to force ourselves into. Boundaries and being comfortable saying no, willingness to listen and consider others' opinions. The theory sounds great, right? But why is being assertive so hard for us when we're neurodivergent? And this is an absolute piece of string question in a lot of ways, because neurodivergent experiences are so varied. It could be any number of things, that we spend so much time feeling overwhelmed and anxious that we don't have much energy left to advocate for ourselves, that we can struggle with reading social cues and the give and take of reciprocal conversations, so we just bow out and avoid it wherever possible, that we can struggle to get other people's points of view in a conflict situation, that we tend to always blame ourselves over others because of our executive function and organizing shortfalls, because we don't trust our own emotional regulation to have a boundary setting conversation without getting angry and flipping our lid. All sorts of things. I think first and foremost, it's hard to be assertive if you lack confidence and self-esteem. We respond very, very keenly to criticism because we're constantly on the defensive, and we'll often take comments that were intended as helpful advice as an outright attack on our very being. And this is known as rejection sensitivity, if you're not familiar with it, and is a huge part of neurodivergent profiles that I'll get into with a full video at some point. Learning calm assertiveness is changing the narrative around the way you think of yourself. If you think of yourself positively and of having innate self-worth, you'll hold yourself positively and speak with self-worth. If you think of yourself as worthless, that's how you'll present yourself, and that's how you'll be received. I think we all get the theory of that, but putting it into practice is the hard bit, and that's where the work begins of undoing years worth of damage done from living inauthentically. Before and during communication, for example, we can ask ourselves 3 questions. Instead of reacting to other people, before we communicate, we can ask ourselves, what is it I want to communicate to this person or group? And write down key bullets if that's easier than holding it in your head. And during that interaction, ask yourself, am I communicating points clearly? Am I being listened to? And do I need to repeat my points? Self-esteem and assertiveness kind of go hand in hand. If you've got shitty self-esteem or high anxiety, of course it will be harder to be assertive. But if you can start to practice and pre-game the conversation with key points and then stay steady throughout, you will essentially train yourself to naturally be more assertive and less passive or aggressive or submissive or any of the other things we end up shooting ourselves in the foot with. Your self-esteem will probably start to improve, and you see people react more positively towards your ideas and opinions. A small thing you can start with is not accepting negative comments about you as absolutes. I think we can all have a tendency to have our defensive radars on for any and all criticism, because we're so attuned to being in defensive mode that we forget to hear compliments and just dismiss them. We play defensively, right? We play for a draw to not get scored against instead of playing positively for a win. And I think we get so used to not winning that whenever we get through a day without being criticized, it can feel like a victory. I only realized this recently about myself, and I don't know whether it chimes with you guys too, but we really need to change the narrative we hold about ourselves. We need to stop playing for a draw each and every day and start thinking about how to play for some wins. An assertive response is to consider feedback or criticism as an outside observer, taking your hurt feelings out of the equation and think whether the critical feedback you've received is A, true, B, not true, or C, partly true. And spoiler, it's almost always C. And there's almost always a way we can adjust our approach on things for future. But when our low self-esteem gets us stuck on A or B, we're just not receptive to considering how we might adjust our own approaches to things in future. And we become quite rigid and inflexible. And how many of us on the spectrum will have heard that feedback about ourselves before? When you act assertively, you can learn to say, thanks for that, I can see why you'd think that, and it's given me something to think about. Not sure about the second thing you said, though. It seems a bit unfair. Could I ask you to explain it a bit more about what you mean? And just be mega reasonable and pleasant and well-adjusted and take everything positively and constructively. Easy, right? We also, again, because of self-esteem and masking, we often say yes to demands that we just can't face. We suck at saying no. We suck at setting boundaries. We're often what can be known as the lightest rock. People will go around testing others to see if they'll do things, and neurodivergent people often have the least amount of resistance. People place demands on us because we say yes. There are ways of saying no that are assertive, polite, and firm, and don't leave us riddled with guilt or self-hatred, like, sorry, I'm too busy right now, maybe another time. I'd love to, but I can't take on anything else at the moment. I want to help you, but I'm just not up to it at the moment. Sometimes people can be persistent and won't take no for an answer, and we can then cave in because we think we've disappointed them. Enough of all that low self-esteem, lightest rock stuff. It's just about keeping repeating no calmly and firmly. And then don't overanalyze and churn and beat yourself up about it afterwards. You weren't mean or a bad person or a useless person. You were just firm and assertive. And people learn to respect that self-confidence if you do it persistently. You stop being the lightest rock, and people will stop testing you to see if you topple over and say yes to everything. If someone's placing demands on you without asking, and those demands make you feel stressed and upset, tell them. Like, tell them, when you ask or tell me to do X, it makes me feel like Y. I don't like to feel like Y, so I'm going to need you to do Z going forward. You're not caving in, but you're not blowing your top either. You're being calm, reasonable, and assertive. And how empowering is that? It vary. But how easy is that to start doing after years of not doing that? Again, yeah, not so much. So take your time, try it with baby steps and see what kind of reaction you get. Stay positive. Know that you're starting, even if very, very slowly, to move yourself in a really positive direction. Look, none of this is easy. It's all aspiration central. I've done myself a huge amount of damage over the years by being variously passive, submissive, passive-aggressive, manipulative, and downright aggressive at times. But I very rarely had the confidence to just be straight up assertive while remaining calm, polite, and firm. And I hate that about the way I've been the lightest rock at times in my life and been a pushover to prove something to people. And I want to do better. And I want to be better for myself, for my own benefit, and maybe you guys do too. This is not going to come overnight, but we can learn behaviors, right? It might take us longer, but if we know what to shoot for, we can learn to turn back outwards again and engage with the world positively, run into the fire. yes, communication is difficult for neurodivergent people. Actually, correction, with a tip of the hat to Damian Milton, communication with neurotypical people is difficult for neurodivergent people. And communicating calmly and assertively, doubly so. But I think if we put it on a hill, understand it, and keep trying to move towards it, I genuinely believe it's a destination we can get to. And I think it's a destination we need to get to. This is not about saying neurodivergent people need to act more neurotypical, by the way, or mask more, or communicate differently. And I really hope this little episode on assertiveness I've done is not taken that way. People can communicate very badly, full stop, neurotypical and neurodivergent alike. And I genuinely think we can all do better. This is about saying there might be some kind of common high ground on communication to be found. And yes, our neurodivergent side of the hill might be a bit steeper to climb than theirs to get to that common ground. But that when reasonable people of either neurotype meet and communicate well, then maybe there's a chance magic might happen and we can create a space where every mind is valued and can thrive, and being assertive and having self-worth is the norm rather than feeling like something crazy difficult to aspire to. That's got to be the dream, right? No song unsung, no wine untasted. Anyway, that's me for the week. I hope at least some of that all made sense. Cheers and see you soon.